Hello, everyone. It's Phil Jones from Projector Reviews, and joining me is Brian Gluck from projectorscreen.com. And we just hosted the Ultra Short Throw Projector Showdown. And we wanted to spend a little time talking about the event and some of the findings, and how do you use those findings to find the best Ultra Short Throw projector for you. So, Brian, how are you?
I'm doing excellent, Phil. Thank you very much. Long time no see. We spent a good deal of time last week together, and I'm sure you're enjoying your break from me.
Exactly. A lot of time in a darkened room looking at imagery. So Brian, before we get started, can you talk a little bit about your company and what do you guys do?
Sure. Well, our company is projectorscreen.com. We are one of the web's leading retailers in projection equipment and related home theater and audiovisual gear. This is our third year of hosting a showdown type of event around ultra short throw projectors. And each year, it keeps getting bigger and better. And this year we were fortunate enough to have you join us, as our showrunner and producer, and help us take it to the next level. When it comes to what our business does is we're really a consultative sales organization. When it comes to projection systems, we're not just pushing boxes. We specialize in mid to premium type of gear, and we've really found our niche in the ultra short throw space and are potentially the largest retailer of ultra short throw projectors in the USA.
So I'm a big fan of Brian and his team because I always say there's no such thing as a one-item solution. If you want a great entertainment experience, you need the projector, the screen, and probably some sound. So being able to go one place, talk to somebody who's knowledgeable to find the right pieces of the puzzle to assemble the best performance for your environment is critical. And when he gave me the opportunity to help out with this event, I leaped at the opportunity because it's really, really hard, even as a reviewer, to remember what you saw 3 months ago. So I have the opportunity to review a lot of projectors, but half the time I'm comparing them based on my memory, which could be a little jaded, or my perspective could be slightly off, or I'm using measurements. And a lot of times measurements do not relate to actual performance. So being able to put multiple projectors in a room and look at them all at the same time really helps you understand the strengths and weaknesses of each projector. So Brian, why don't you talk about the layout of the room and what did you guys do to prepare for this?
Sure, absolutely. So, the room is laid out with 8 identical Spectra Projection Vantage 0.5 gain ambient light rejecting screens for ultra short throw projectors. They're mounted on Spectra Projection UST specific carts, which allow easy movement of the items around as we're shuffling and setting up, and also provides you a solution for potential people in the commercial space or in the residential space that don't really want to mount the screen permanently to the wall. As far as lighting, that was a challenge that we've had to overcome as we developed this type of event in our facility. And what we ended up doing this year to ensure uniform ambient lighting hitting all of the screens is we have affixed multiple color, temperature, and dimmable bulbs to the rear of the frames that were angled up at the ceiling, which is a white drop ceiling tile, kind of emulative of the ceiling that you may find in a traditional living room where these projectors are commonly used. That reflective of the light, illuminated the room to, moderate to high levels of ambient light to allow comparison of what these would be like in a well-lit room. And then obviously, Phil was able to turn the lights off and emulate a darkened environment, which is more along the lines of a dedicated theater room or even your living room with all of the lights off.
Okay, so the setup was amazing. But I have another question for you, and I'm sure people are going to ask out there. Because you are projectorscreen.com, you have a huge amount of screens that you can choose from. What made you choose this material for this particular event?
Sure. Well, first of all, I do have to say Spectra Projection, the manufacturer, did help sponsor an event that we did before we even started doing the showdowns, which was a showcase that we did with AVS Forum. So they provided us a plethora of screens, and we continue to use them in our show space. So thank you for sponsoring the Spectra Projection. But that also being said, this screen has been rated as the best performing ultra short throw projection screen by several reviewers and YouTubers, and it's one of our best selling products. So it's a really great value that falls in line with the price point of the average selling price of the ultra short throw projectors and performs on the level of some of the more premium brands, that could be 2 to 3 times the cost of the similar size of the Spectra.
And they did a really good job. And you put little spacers or kind of little small, think of them as like 1 foot
Blinders
walls,
is what we're calling them.
blinders, blinders between the projectors. So there was very little interaction between the projectors. The only time that it would really have mattered is when in really dark scenes. But guess what? They were all showing the same dark scene. So the odds of them interacting with each other, even in those dark scenes, what they were adding to the screen was minor. And because it was ambient light rejecting, even if there was a little bit more light in the room, the screens did a very good job of eliminating that. And of course, we'd like to thank Kaleidoscape, who provided us with the sources. We also use a Panasonic Blu-ray player on one of the Spears and Muscle UHD test discs, and of course AV Pro for providing the matrix switches and the bullet train optical cables.
Bullet train cables. Yeah, Phil, if you don't mind, I want to just address one thing about like the blinders, right? So just for the enthusiasts who are watching this and are really into it, the spectral projection screens have a relatively wide viewing angle, and we actually measured the light coming off on the horizontal axis, and we created the blinders to prevent any of that light spill off axis from hitting the screens that were next to it. So there would be no spill or no reflection coming from one screen to the screen directly to the side of it. But about the level playing field, not only did we make it level in terms of the lighting that we used, but every projector was plugged into a power conditioner, and we used the same 90-foot spool of bullet train cables for every projector, regardless of where they were positioned in the room. So there was no shorter run of cable to the projector closest to the console, which could potentially have given it a signal advantage over a projector on the other side of the room. So everything was as evenly set from a technology perspective as well as a lighting environment perspective as humanly possible.
Yeah, and I've done actually TV shootouts, and viewing angle is a problem a lot of times, especially flat panels when we were evaluating LCDs. Because it was projection and the screen's viewing angle was very wide, it made it a little easier to look at 2 projectors or 3 projectors side by side. I've done the LCD where you got to stand directly in front and then walk over to the other one, stand directly in front, and then walk back and stand directly in front every single time, because you were worried that if I'm a little bit off axis, it's going to affect my brightness, or the black levels and things like that, or I was going to see blooming. The projectors in this setup, while we did go stand in front of them to look at the small details, it was nice to be able to step back and see a perspective of all of them at the same time. That was actually really nice.
Well, and that kind of addresses the comment that you made earlier about, some of the uniqueness about this event, where you're able to look at all of these projectors at the same time, as opposed to recalling from memory projector A that you saw 3 weeks ago versus one that you saw 2 months ago versus one that you saw today, and trying to compare them. So, we believe why this event is so valuable is because of that purpose, right? You are able to sit in this room and theoretically rotate 360 degrees and always have, 4 projectors in your field of view to be able to compare them, directly against each other.
Now, it's interesting thing is you have, like, a lot of projectors utilize, a similar DLP chip. 1 or 2 companies make most of the light sources. A lot of times they utilize the same 1 or 2 different operating systems. So you would think they would be identical, but they weren't. It shows how much attention to detail when it comes to tuning, video processing, and the decisions that the manufacturers make really impacted the performance. And this was incredibly noticeable when we got to HDR. Specs, things that were on paper that had better specs, sometimes did not deliver that believed performance advantage during the event. So,
sure. I would say a great example is like brightness, right? That's one of the number one most important specifications that people are taking into consideration when they're evaluating which UST may be right for them. And some projectors may have the highest level of brightness, but that doesn't necessarily translate into a better image quality, right? So brighter is better for cutting through ambient light, but it's not necessarily better from an overall enjoyment perspective. And then we had other items here as well that had a much higher native contrast ratio, but that didn't necessarily translate to having better black level or shadow detail. And, after the event, we had our calibrator run through and measure the contrast ratios, well, the peak brightness as well as the black floor of each projector. And we were able to calculate a contrast ratio. And one of the ones that did the best from a black level and shadow detail in the mode as it was configured by the manufacturer was actually measured at 50% of what its highest native contrast ratio was actually capable of. So in that particular example, the image processing, tone mapping, and some of the other secret sauce, software wise, made a bigger difference than just a specification measurement in terms of what the contrast ratio is.
Exactly. And a lot of times when you look at brightness, it's torch mode, leprechaun green. If you're a customer, a lot of times you're going to utilize the picture mode that is built into the projector, or you will utilize that mode and make a few minor adjustments. Over here, I have like a $10,000 measuring meter and $7,000 or $8,000 in signal processing and thousands of dollars in software to calibrate projectors. While somebody who's buying a $30,000 projector may do that, someone who's buying a $2,500 projector is not going to spend $700 to $1,000 to have someone come in and spend 2.5 hours calibrating it. First thing is Brian pulled the projectors from his inventory. Because a lot of times as a reviewer, we get golden samples, which are designed specifically for us. And we're not really sure if that's exactly what the customer's going to get.
Phil, if you don't mind, I'd like to address that. To me, that's like a very crucial detail of this event, right? All of these units were pulled out of inventory. So these are representative of what any consumer would get themselves when purchasing something. And to Phil's point, it's a very common practice that goes back a very long time in the audiovisual industry, where when manufacturers are going to send a reviewer or a contest a particular product, they're not choosing it randomly, right? They're picking the best of all the items that they've tested. But additionally, sometimes, they are going into the service menu. They may be overclocking it to produce a higher level of brightness because they're not concerned about the longevity of that product lasting before pixels go out or other types of issues happen. They just need it to look as good as possible for the time that the reviewer or the competition has it in their hands. So, I always suggest that you consider that when you're evaluating the credibility of a particular review, where that product was gotten from. Was it provided by the manufacturer solely for the purpose of an influencer to talk great about it? Or was it something that was actually yanked out of inventory, which is what you as the end user who's reading these reviews or watching these reviews would expect to have for yourself should you acquire one of them?
Exactly. So we wanted to make sure that what we tested was what you could buy, right? The next thing that we did was we went to each manufacturer and said, you provide us with the best recommended picture settings. Because a lot of times if I made those adjustments, the manufacturer may say, well, you should have done something else. So to make sure that everybody was happy, we asked them to provide their recommended picture modes. We also, Brian even gave them the opportunity to come and adjust the projector before the event. Now, we did give them some stipulations. Don't show up with a $40,000 camera and plug your laptop into the USB, the RS-232 port, and get into the service menu and start making adjustments. You need to use readily available test patterns that you can get on YouTube or download from the internet, video that is readily available to anyone, and utilize the more common settings that anybody could do themselves. Brightness, contrast, color, temperature, gamma, motion, those types of things. Things that if I gave you those settings, you could do yourself at home utilizing stuff that's free on the internet. So that was the other thing that we wanted to do with this.
Sure. So, having this been our third year hosting this type of event in our facility, we've had 3 different protocols essentially on how these units get set up. So in our first year of doing this, we have our in-house calibrator and reviewer who is intimately familiar with each of these projectors and spent an incredible amount of time understanding the nuance of them to not only calibrate them via ISF calibration standards for color accuracy, but also enable the settings that really made the projector look the best. But of course, we still had some unhappy manufacturers who said, oh, well, you should have done this or you should have done that, or you calibrated theirs better than you calibrated ours. So then year 2, we took a different approach. We're not touching anything, and we're going to have an independent third-party ISF certified calibrator configure everything, right? Then, of course, yet again, there was some criticism from the manufacturers that said, hey, yeah, your calibrator made it accurate, but he didn't enable this active black setting, or he didn't crank sharpness to 7 when we think it looks better at 7 than it does out of the box at 5. So yet again, we couldn't please anyone. So this year, the approach that, Phil and I took for the event was like, hey, manufacturers, you are responsible for this at this point. Now you're not going to say we calibrated it incorrectly. You're not going to say we neglected to put it on a particular setting. No one knows your projector better than you. And sure, you may think it's perfect out of the box. Well, that's fantastic. But if you feel that there are other ways to enhance the image that may be more desirable to the audience of this event based off of knowing what the content we're going to be using is and the criteria on which it's going to be judging is, and even the environment of the room, now you set it up. And some manufacturers took it a little bit more seriously than others. And, the ones that took it more seriously, may have fared better in the eyes of the judges.
Yes. And the other thing about calibration, I've been in these shootouts on both sides, representing a manufacturer back in the days, and actually as a judge. Some projectors, when you calibrate them, could be done in about 10 minutes. Other ones could take 3 hours. So guess what? The one that won, you calibrate it. All of a sudden, this one won. But, oh, yeah, we didn't tell you that one took 3 hours. And the one that came in second place took 10 minutes, So to us, we said, let's make it more like the real world, things
Sure.
that you could do. Now, the other thing we have to talk about is this reference and preference.
Thank you, Phil. I was just about to get into that as well.
A lot of times you go to these events and they're so into, it has to be exactly D 6,500 degrees Kelvin. It can't exceed this many foot lamperts on this screen. And then people look at it at home and say, I don't like that. It's funny, half the people who set it up that way look at it and you give them a blind test, they choose the other way. So what we said was, think about how someone's going to be using this, the use case of this projector, sometimes in a daylight, sports, HDR, SDR, brightness is really important. And you determine what's the best balance between brightness and performance and black level and color that would appeal to the majority of people. And it did actually, when they took that into account, you could see that even the judges gravitated towards ones that weren't exactly accurate when it came to their preferences.
And, it's a unique point as well, because, when you are truly calibrating a projector according to ISF standards, you can absolutely affect the brightness. You can affect the contrast ratio. So some projectors where brightness or contrast may be their strongest suits, after a calibration, you could kind of be removing their special mojo and kind of depreciating it by virtue of calibrating it. So, some projectors are engineered to be as accurately as possible for the intended customer of that projector, and other ones are engineered to be, bright and enjoyable to the average person. Like when you walk into a television showroom, those televisions are not set to be accurate. They're set to, store mode, which is just extra vibrant and extra bright and kind of draws your attention. And the thing that's even more unique about this when it comes to ultra short throw projectors is the majority of them, in the contest, at least this year, are triple laser, right? So what that means is your color source is also your light source. So as you start to tame down some colors to get it to be more reference accurate, you're also diminishing the brightness. So, you could really be impacting the viewability of that projector in well-lit environments by trying to get it to be reference accurate, which ultimately may make that projector not be viewed as favorably in the eyes of the judges, considering all of the different ambient lighting conditions. And the manufacturers who came and set it up themselves or provided us the settings, were advised to take all of that into consideration when they chose how to adjust the colors, as part of the configuration process. So, one of the particular contestants decided to use cinema mode, right? And I'm not going to say who the names are. We'll wait till, the article is out there and everyone can read up in our write-ups, what we're saying. But that particular manufacturer had certain strengths when it came to dynamic contrast and brightness. And those strengths were really evident in dynamic mode. And that's exactly what the judges last year found with this particular product. And that was mentioned in the videos and the write-ups and all of that type of stuff. But this year, that manufacturer, given the option to configure it themselves, decided to put it in cinema mode. And while that may be more reference accurate, it totally neutered those two strengths of that particular projector to the point where, the judges did not feel as strongly about that projector as what we saw from a different judging panel in last year's showdown.
So let's talk about some of the judging criterias. So at first, I've been to these things where they have like SDR bright mode and SDR dark mode, and HDR bright, HDR dark, SDR bright, SDR dark. People don't do that most of the time. Most of the time, you pick the best mode for SDR, and then you pick the best mode for HDR. So that's the way that we judged it. We judged first, we looked at SDR, and we looked at things such as, black level and shadow detail, contrast, color accuracy, screen brightness. How bright is it really? Not what it measured on a test pattern, but in the mode they picked, how bright was it? 24p motion. Is it sharp? And is it sharp? How is it sharp from edge to edge? A lot of these ultra short throw projectors that we reviewed, they do not come with a screen. So you have the option of picking a screen that Brian has to offer, and a wide range of sizes. So the question is, how well does that projector adapt to the size of the screen, which that we chose, which was, how big was the screens? There were 100s, correct?
We used 100s. Now, in an ideal world, as TVs are getting larger, 100-inch projection is diminishing in popularity, but we have spatial requirements. I mean, these screens are huge, and to have 8 of them set up, at the same time in a particular room, if we went up to 120s or even the 150 that many of these projectors are capable of, we would have had to, rent a warehouse. So, we tried to do the best job that we could, representative, while still maintaining a very large image that's, a substantial size. But that smaller size also allowed all of the projectors to be more visible, right? And that just comes into the laws of physics and light dispersion and, ultimately foot Lamberts. And I'm not going to bore everyone here about that, but you can read the foot Lambert article on our blog if you want to learn more about what all of that stuff means.
Exactly. Basically, that screen was within the recommended range of screens for all of these projectors.
Correct.
The smaller screen actually is an advantage for a projector, because colors shown brighter appear to be more saturated. That is just how your eye works. So the smaller screen is the best scenario for these projectors when it comes to the ability to deliver color and highlight detail. But that's what I wanted to mention. So we also measured, overall brightness, and then daytime viewing. Daytime viewing was basically, we turned on all the lights and said, okay, how well does this image combat or pierce through all of this ambient light? And one thing we've noticed is some of the projectors that are a little bit more oversaturated, that is a benefit when they're set that way, when you're trying to pierce through a ton of daylight or fluorescent lights in a room. So
yeah, and that was evident in the judges' scores, right? So we had one particular projector that had some challenges adapting to the right color space in SDR, where it was still producing much more oversaturated images. And that projector actually won in the point total for the SDR round. So, that's another issue of reference versus preference. The judges preferred that particular model versus ones that would have been more traditionally accurate, because it really cut through the ambient light and, gave them and I hate to use the word, but a punchy image.
Exactly. Now, we also did HDR. Normally I hear them say tone mapping. Why do you need to tone map before we get into tone mapping? Tone mapping is because you have a huge amount of brightness, this massive brightness level, this massive box of crayons in HDR material. But the projector does not have that brightness level, that brightness range to do that. So now you're trying to fit this massive amount of brightness into something that cannot do it. So you cannot accurately follow the contrast curve or the EOTF in HDR. So you bend the curve. And by doing so, it's kind of a fine art. There's no right or wrong way to do it. But the goal is the black should be as black as possible, but you still should be able to see objects in near black. The next thing is you need to maintain your overall brightness, because I've seen many HDR projectors that when it tries to track it perfectly, the image is too dark to be satisfying, especially in a room with ambient light. So be able to maintain the blacks and shadow detail while still being bright when you need to be, and not clipping the highlights. So we looked at highlight detail, average picture level or full screen brightness, and black level. All three of those determine its tone mapping. So instead of just giving it one big score, we broke it into its three basics. We also looked at visual artifacts. Those are going to be visible whether you're looking at SDR or HDR. Things like rainbow, color fringing, chromatic aberrations,
Laser speckle,
banding, and things like that. And then we judged those as well. So, and from that, there was a scorecard. Brian he's the mathematician. He'll talk about how the scores were done. And then, and based on, we have scores for the judges' picks and for points. So Brian, why don't you talk about the projectors that were in the shootout?
Absolutely. So I'll just do them in order from left to right as they circled around the room. This has nothing to do with any of the rankings or scoring. But the first one was the Hisense PX3-Pro. This is a relatively new projector. It's the successor to the previous model, which was the PX2-Pro. And the PX2-Pro tied for second place last year in the 2023 Showdown. One of the things that's unique about the PX3-Pro is that they really improved upon the previous model. They went from around 1,000-to-1 native contrast up to 3,000-to-1. They've enabled some dynamic contrast, which is far more significant. They did some AI image processing and some other things. So that projector retails for around $3,500.
Mm-hmm.
The model that was next to it was the Hisense PL2. So that is their single laser projector versus the triple laser of the PX3-Pro. That retails for around $2,500, and it's the successor of the PL1. Next to that was the Formovie Cinema Edge. That is a new projector from Formovie. It is a single laser projector that's retailing around $1,900. It doesn't really have a predecessor here in the USA, but globally its predecessor would have been the Cinema 3. Next to that was the new Formovie Theater Premium. This is the successor to the winner of the previous 2 years Showdown, which is the Formovie Theater. The Premium, they've updated with 400 additional lumens, shorter throw distance. They've changed the operating system to Google TV, so it's got Netflix native. They've enhanced the Bowers & Wilkins sound system. And I'm sure something else that I'm neglecting right now, but that has come in at the $3,000 price point. Next to that was the Epson LS800. The LS800 tied with the PX2-Pro for the judges' pick in the 2023 Showdown. It is the #1 best-selling UST by market share as reported by NPD/Circana Marketing Research. And it retails, I think the MSRP is $3,500, but it's very commonly on sale for sub $3,000. Next to that, we have the Nexigo Aurora Pro. That too is in last year's contest, but unfortunately, their latest firmware update, which really enhanced the dynamic contrast aspects of this projector, didn't arrive until after the event was being taken. So many people felt like it didn't really get a fair shake. So, Nexigo flew out this year, configured it themselves, make sure it had everything up to date so that they had their best foot forward. And you can read the results and see how well or not that fared for them. But that retails for about $26.99. Next to that, we have the brand new XJimmy Aura 2. XJimmy had their Aura 1 in the 2022 Showdown, but they did not participate in 2023. This particular projector retails for, I believe, $26.99 at this point, and it's really unique in a way that it's utilizing a dual laser LED light engine. It's a hybrid. Nothing else in the competition is doing that. They're all either single laser or triple laser. So the XJimmy has some very unique features and did well in certain areas, and you'll get to see how that is when you look at the scorecard. And then last but not least, we have the brand new Samsung Premier 9, the LPU9D. They had a Premier 9 previously, but that had a different part number. It was the LSP9T. This is the most expensive projector of the bunch. This retails for $59.99. It utilizes its own Samsung Tizen operating system, and I don't know what else to say about it other than,
well, yeah,
see the results of the video, or I'll let Phil break the news, any way that he sees fit.
Yeah. So, as he mentioned, several of the manufacturers either provided their measurements or came and tuned the units themselves. We gave everyone the opportunity, and Samsung decided to decline to do that. But this is a new projector, and I'm sure everybody out there was curious about its performance and how does it stack up against the models that are currently quite popular. So Brian believed, and I believe, that this unit should be included in the shootout. So the fairest way that I could see doing it, it was my call, was I put it into its filmmaker mode. Most brands, and based on my prior experience in most projectors, the filmmaker mode or the movie mode is the most accurate mode out of the box. And if you talk to most manufacturers, that's the mode they're going to tell you. If you're going to evaluate things such as color accuracy and highlight detail and shadow detail, you should put the projector in. So that's what we did. That mode is not one of the brightest modes. It's not one of the more saturated modes. Could that have helped its positioning in the competition? Possibly. But it's not Brian's call or my call to make that decision. That is the decision that the manufacturer needed to be here to make. So,
Sure.
so we put it in the most accurate mode. If the manufacturer wanted to put in something that was not the most accurate mode, that would have been their call.
Sure. And I also just want to mention, I've had many conversations with Samsung. Phil and I sat on a call with a whole slew of people from Samsung's headquarters explaining what the event is and the content and the criteria. Their QA lab is less than 30 minutes from our office. So Samsung was really given every opportunity to either come down themselves and do it or provide us some guidance or some recommended settings. And they opted not to, and I'm not going to speculate why, but we just want to emphasize the fact that everyone had the opportunity, and Samsung physically was in our proximity and had we both communicate with them fairly frequently, but they just opted to decline providing any sort of insight or participation.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so those are the projectors. So now let's talk a little bit about the scores and how and what were your results, Brian?
Cool. Well, what we did is every judge was provided a scorecard, and they rated a numeric value in each of the various criteria. So then additionally, at the end of the event, they were asked to choose their top 3 favorites in SDR, HDR, and overall. So when we tabulated all of the scores, we were able to determine from a point tabulation perspective the ranking and order of each of the projectors. Then additionally, what we really took into account was the judges' overall picks, because when the judges were asked to choose something for their overall pick, 1, 2, 3, it didn't just take into account the point tabulation and the scorecard that they had in front of them, but it took into account a lot of the other properties of the projector that weren't necessarily part of the competition itself. The operating system, the features such as 3D or low lag time, the price or anything else that may influence their subjective opinion on this projector and where it would stand from a judge's pick perspective. Mm-hmm. So I do have the results in front of me in terms of the point tabulation as well as the judge's pick.
I opted not to be a judge because I was the host. So I could be basically look over the fence and see what everybody was doing. I am going to write an article, which is going to come out, about my perspectives and what I saw based on me looking at the judges and their reactions to things that were going on. So an overview of what the jury was doing, right? And Brian, you could actually share the scores because it's kind of interesting. The judges' picks do not often align with things such as the points, which is quite interesting.
Sure. So Phil, you just raised a good point about the judging. I don't think we got into how these were judged and who we brought on and why, right? So to clarify, neither Phil or I had any input into the scoring, right? We were brought in a panel of 6 independent judges, ranging from professional ISF calibrators and projector reviewers to technology experts and YouTubers. So we had a relatively well-rounded and diverse panel to provide their opinions on all of this. I'd be glad to share the results right now. So we will start with our judges' pick overall, because this is the one factor that all the judges took into consideration to determine the 1, 2, and 3. So in this area, it was relatively overwhelmingly the Hisense PX3-Pro. I believe 5 out of the 6 judges may have placed it in that number 1 rank. Number 2 this year, we had a tie. Both the Formovie Theater Premium and the Nexigo Aurora Pro tied for second place. Now, one thing I also want to emphasize here is how this was determined. So this was really done via a ranked choice mechanism. So for every first place choice that a projector got, they were awarded 3 points. If it was put in number 2, it got 2 points, and number 3, it got 1 point. And then all of those scores were tabulated together to come up with a point total, and that's what determined the 1, 2, 3 ranking order. We're not really going to go beyond the 3 because we love everyone and everyone should be happy. And this isn't about saying who is the worst projector. This is really about defining who the best ones are based off of what the criteria was and who the judges were.
I would take every single one of these projectors home. None of them were bad, right? They all had strengths and they all had weaknesses. The reason why some of them won on points or won on judges' picks was because they did several things well, right? So, for example, when the judges first came in, I told them, you're grading on a curve, because they were just downstairs looking at a couple of $30,000, cinema projectors. And I'm like, if you're trying to compare black levels, color accuracy, shadow detail, and sharpness against a $30,000 projector, these poor guys are in trouble. So I said, think of it like you're a teacher and you're grading on a curve. The ones that do better get A's, and then you work your way down. And most things got A's and B's. There were some C's, not a lot, but nobody got all A's. Nobody. None of these did. But the ones that won were, several A's and a couple of B's.
And what is also interesting, which we could discuss after we go through the rest of these, is that scoring highest from a point total did not necessarily equate to being chosen a judge's pick.
One of the other projectors, it was about its ability to lift dark details out of the shadows to make movies like Game of Thrones and shows like Game of Thrones and The Batman more watchable on a projector. And that weighed with the judges so much that it really helped elevate that projector above a lot of other things. All right.
Cool. So we'll talk about the point total. So we aggregated both the SCR and the HDR, took the sum of all of those points, and we came up with an overall point total. So again, here, the Hisense PX3-Pro had the highest score, coming in first place from a point total perspective. And again, the Formovie Theater Premium came in second place when tabulating all of the points. But what's interesting here is the third place from a point total tabulation was the Hisense PL2. And that's that single laser projector, which even though it scored in 3 from a point total, was still not selected as an overall judge's pick in the top 3. Then if we break down the components of the point total, we have both SDR and HDR. So from an SDR point total perspective, the first place was the Formovie Theater Premium. Second place was the Hisense PX3-Pro. And third place again was the Hisense PL2. Then if we look at the HDR point total, again, first place was the Hisense PX3-Pro. Second place was the Hisense PL2. And third place was the Nexigo Aurora Pro. And we have a chart of all of this that, Phil may superimpose into here, but it will be visible with all of the individual point scoring on both Projector Reviews as well as projectorscreen.com.
That was the results of the contest. But how you should be picking a projector is looking at the things that factor most to you and weighing those heavier based on your needs. So I'll give you an example. The XGME Aura, the Aura 2, its SDR color reproduction, it was fantastic, but it wasn't the brightest and it didn't have the deepest black. But if you're someone that truly cares about color reproduction, you may weigh that pretty heavily, but when it went to HDR, really bright, high brightness HDR content, highlights were blown out unless you were looking at, unless you had Dolby Vision. So if you're someone that's a stickler for SDR, for color reproduction, and you watch a lot of SDR, you got a ton of Blu-rays, you got a ton of old DVDs, you like to watch a ton of old classic movies and things like that, and most of the HDR you're watching is in Dolby Vision because it supported Dolby Vision, and the picture looked great in Dolby Vision, this may be a good option for you.
Absolutely. And I just want to touch a point about the XGME Aura too, because when it was really challenged by the stressful content, the high brightness HDR stuff, did not perform so well in the eyes of the judges. But that same exact content, when it was pushed to the projectors via Dolby Vision, well, it managed it much better,
It looked great.
So, one of the things is, most of these projectors are relatively new, right? And we should be expecting updates to all of them in various different ways. And, it's quite possible that XJimmy does an update in the future to do a better job of its internal tone mapping for dealing with, HDR content. It's also possible that every other projector releases updates to address other types of things too. And the additional point I want to put in here, again, because I love everyone, right? And all of these brands produce a great product, is that the results could have totally been different based off of how any of them were configured. So manufacturer A may have said, this is what I think, but you as the end user may disagree with what they think is best, and you may have used a different picture mode. You may have enabled a different level of sharpening. You may have, adjusted the gamma, right? So this contest and this judging is based off of a very specific configuration of each projector, but that was what was provided by the manufacturer as they say this is best. So, your mileage may vary, your taste buds are different than mine, all of those other types of things to take into account.
Yeah, because after the judging was all done, we said, okay, let's take them out of the mode, some of these out of the mode that the manufacturers recommended, and how would you do it? And many of the reviewers, for example, including me, absolutely love the Epson. So they went in and said, boop, boop, boop. Here's the modes that we use. And it was like, bang, holy cow, that its strength immediately was apparent. And that was the massive amount of brightness it can deliver, and the fact that it could deliver equal amounts of color lumens as it is white lumens. And that is a huge benefit if you're watching a projector in a room with ambient light or on a massive screen. But it looked great. It still delivered a pretty accurate picture, but it really pulled out its strengths a lot more.
Sure, and then the cat's out of the bag, right? So that was the projector I was referring to in the beginning of this conversation, that the manufacturer chose a particular mode, which I believe neutered two of the biggest strengths of the projector. So it's the Epson LS800 that tied for second place in last year's showdown, and specifically it was its dynamic mode when it was enabled that provided such a substantial level of brightness and dynamicism, to the particular image. Now it's totally not color accurate, and the Epson lacks full CMS or color management system controls that you're going to find in a lot of these other ones. So it certainly can't be calibrated to the same level or dialed in, but when you put that thing on dynamic mode and you have a lot of lights on in the room, you have a very saturated, bright image, which is quite appealing and something that I could easily recommend for certain people based off of what they plan on watching and the environment in which they plan on watching it.
And this is another, before we let you guys go, this is another example of being able to see them all side by side. And it changes your perspective. I did the review on the LS800. I loved it. Even though it didn't have a lot of adjustments, it was pretty impressive with its color reproduction. And when I was sitting in this room doing these evaluations, it was more than bright enough for me. I had no problems with it. It was just comparing it against multiple projectors and the reduction in brightness or the lack of using its full brightness potential in this particular application, in this particular comparison, did not help it.
And I'll put this out there just real quick. The Showdown setup is still set up, and we plan on keeping it so for many weeks. We've already had several people come by, both on the manufacturing side as well as prospective customers. So anyone watching, if you feel like taking the trip to northern New Jersey, you're more than welcome to give us a call, and we're happy to let you have your own personal showdown with the projectors exactly as set up as they were, for this particular contest.
Yeah, and we're also going to share the demos that we played. So if you have a Kaleidoscape or you have the disc, you could try those out on your own projectors, and we'll share them with the manufacturers so they can see, okay, because a lot of these demos are designed to be torture tests. So we might as well share what those torture tests are with the manufacturers. So that's it for me. Brian, thank you for coming and talking to us about this year's Ultra Short Throw Showdown.
Awesome. Thank you for having me, Phil. It was a pleasure, and I look forward to seeing you again in the next couple months at CES and continuing our conversations and working together.
Yeah, let's do a long throw one now. That's what I want to do.
All right, I'm ready.
Okay. And by the way, there will be some more standby for articles from Brian, from myself, There's also going to be a more detailed video where you get to see who was the judges and how was it, what was the feeling in the room, and that's going to be coming probably a couple of days later than this.
Within a week, yeah. Please be patient, everyone. Those videos take some time to produce. We have a lot of footage to edit, but it will be coming. But you'll be able to read about all the results and the experience on both of our websites.
All right. So take care, everyone, and we will talk to you soon.
Excellent.